Christos Voskres. Dear friends, since the talk is in English, allow me to speak about George in a way that he can understand what I'm saying. It's a real pleasure to introduce a great friend of our university. We have a community composed of different members. Some people here are in Lviv, some people in Ukraine. But what is, I think, unique about this university among Ukrainian universities is that we have such dedicated friends who live lives far away from here. George Weigel is one of the few bearers of an honorary doctorate from our university. In 2013, he gave the commencement speech, the speech at the end of the year when students received their diplomas. And probably he will mention it himself, but that was just a few months before the Maidan. No author has written as many articles defending you and me, defending this university, defending the people of Ukraine, defending Christians of Ukraine in the last 5 years as George Weigel. He does so out of a great love for our church. He knows its history. He knows its leadership. He has a good relationship with his Beatitude Svetoslav, the Grand Chancellor of our university. He knew Cardinal Huzar, who expressed to him a request. Maybe George will be able to fulfill it someday, but Cardinal Huzar had a great desire that George write a biography of Metropolitan Sheptytsky. And George has considered, in the past has considered this option. He is known in the world, in every country where there are Christians and Catholics, as the outstanding biographer of probably the most outstanding personality of the 20th century, St. John Paul II. He had a very close personal relationship with the Pope, who gave his blessing to write this biography. George has spent, I think, over 25 summers is it 25? It'll be 27 summers in Poland, in Krakow. He knew the friends of John Paul, those who had been his students, who had been his colleagues, who had worked with him long before he was elected Pope. He got to know Poland very well, Eastern Europe. He was friends with Bohdan Butyurkiw, an eminent political scientist and specialist in Soviet religious policy. So he knew the Soviet Union. He knew Rome, but he could stand a continent apart and look at the global role of St. John Paul II. The biography itself is 2 volumes, close to 1,000 pages in the 2 volumes. Both exist in Ukrainian. This past year, a 3rd volume came out, which is a personal reflection on how the relationship, the writing, how it affected George Weigel personally. He shares his own personal spiritual journey through the relationship of John Paul II. Besides these books, our honorary doctor has authored more than 15 volumes on various subjects. Today he will speak to us about the current state of the political system in Ukraine, in the United States, the state of American society from the point of view of a theologian, a committed Christian, relating that analysis to the yearnings of a young democracy. what can we in Ukraine learn from the achievements and the failures of the American political process? Reported by a Christian who knows Ukraine, who knows Europe, who knows the global church. I'm very grateful to George that, for his support of the university, for the support of our church, support of this country. I'm very grateful that he supports you. Maybe you don't know him yet, but he has loved you a long time ago, and he witnesses to this relationship very regularly. George, it's a real distinct honor and pleasure to greet you at the Ukrainian Catholic University in the Sheptytsky Center.
Thank you very much, Bishop Boris, and good afternoon to everyone. I want to add a special word of greeting to Professor Podlisny here, who invited me to join you by video when the program on politics, business, and ethics, politics, business began. I feel very much at home here. You have been part of my life in many ways for many years, and it's good to be home. To try to make this a little easier from a linguistic point of view, I will put up at the end of my remarks where you can find this lecture in a different form in writing online, because sometimes it's a little easier to read than to hear. And what I'd like to do today is, in fact, broaden the lens, widen the lens a bit beyond what Bishop Boris mentioned, and try to think out loud with you about the democratic situation throughout the Western world. And I want to begin more than 25 years ago when my friend, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama, wrote a very famous essay with the title, "The End of History?" Most people forgot the question mark, and the article, which was later expanded into a book, caused an enormous fuss for about a year and a half. What Frank Fukuyama was proposing was not, of course, the end of history in some apocalyptic sense. What he was suggesting was that the triumph of democracy and the market and free economics had essentially resolved the questions that had been driving the human story since the dawn of modernity. And while I remember saying to him at the time, I don't think history is going to be over. I think there's a lot more to history than politics and economics. There was a sense 25 years ago that these two questions about how to properly organize a political community and how to organize economic life under modern social and cultural conditions, the scientific revolution, etc., had essentially been solved. Things look very, very different today. They look different today because the democratic project is finding itself under assault throughout the world. And not only by adversarial regimes like Vladimir Putin's Russia or Xi Jinping's China, but an assault from within. In Central Europe, the notion of what some call illiberal democracy, a regime in which one party claims a monopoly on national identity and tradition and maintains itself permanently in power, has become part of the political landscape. In the United States, intellectually serious voices assert that ours is an ill-founded republic whose present discontents and dysfunctions are the inevitable result of fatal flaws in the intellectual and moral foundations of American democracy. All over the world, millennials, those young people born since 1980, seem suspicious of democracy and willing to flirt with efficient authoritarianism. The World Values Survey reports that only 30% of American millennials and 43% of European millennials think it essential to live in a country that is governed democratically, while about 35% of millennials around the world think it would be good or very good to have in their countries a strong leader who, as the survey question put it, doesn't have to bother with parliaments and elections. These attitudes aren't confined to millennials, however. Surveys indicate that 1/3 of all Americans would favor authoritarian rule, and 1 in 6 would like the strong man to wear a military uniform. Similar figures are reported in Germany, and some surveys suggest that half the population of both Great Britain and France would welcome some version of authoritarian rule. So, history is clearly not over, and it's possible that the political history of the West will take some nasty turns in the next several decades. Charting the path of democratic renewal requires a sober assessment of these present democratic discontents and a refresher course, a reminder of some basic truths about the nature of democracy and the conditions for its flourishing. Those are both enormous subjects, so what I will speak about here are simply some preliminary notes for beginning a conversation about the democratic project in the 21st century. The most visible and politically consequential critics of contemporary democracy are typically labeled populists. I'm sure you've heard this word. I don't find it a very useful term. It attempts to cover simply too many phenomena with one label. So rather than treat this new populism as a coherent philosophy and program, I suggest that we think about it by analogy to medicine. When we start running a fever, when our temperature goes up, it's a sign that something is wrong in our bodies. And similarly, the various populist fevers and passions that we experience in the Western world are signals that the democratic project, far from being perfected in the post-Cold War world, has got some serious problems. An American historian named George Nash put it very well when he wrote, "Populism gives a voice to the hitherto voiceless who often have legitimate grievances that deserve redress." What are those grievances? What are these populists upset about? As I survey the landscape, the most prominent among populist grievances would seem to me to include the following. First, the first aggravation involves the economic dislocations caused by globalization and the failure of a globalized economy to lift all boats. Secondly, there are widespread fears in Europe of the loss of national sovereignty to distant, unaccountable transnational bureaucracies in Brussels and elsewhere. a grievance that is mirrored in the United States and the concerns of populist activists about the increasingly deep reach of the national government into virtually every aspect of our lives. The third populist grievance involves the skepticism and mockery and scorn that are regularly poured over, like boiling water, poured over traditional cultural institutions and cultural habits by Western elites in the arts, in the universities, the mainstream media, and the entertainment industry. This is a form of cultural authoritarianism that often motivates and sustains state power in enforcing what elites consider enlightened social arrangements, but which many populists regard as policies that erode community cohesion and threaten basic civil rights such as religious freedom. Fourth on my list of populist fevers would be the intuition, which is ominously similar to what was going on in certain European circles in the 1920s and 1930s, where it was thought that democracy is simply incapable of coping with the vast forces of change unleashed by modernity, forces that are, on this view, best harnessed and channeled by authoritarianisms of one sort or another. And here, the aggravations that are felt from Ukraine to California and at all points in between with the dysfunction of democratic institutions and democratic politics can too easily bleed into a deep skepticism about, even contempt for, the democratic project itself. The fifth factor in this populism, I believe, is the one that is talked about the least, and that is the cult of license, whose principal expression is the sexual revolution throughout the Western world, which promises liberation, but does not seem at all to have added to the sum total of human happiness. Yet despite the unhappiness that is evident everywhere with this remarkably swift deconstruction of such institutions as marriage and the family, much less courtship and friendship and so forth, yet despite the unhappiness, this cultural hurricane of a freedom without measure, a freedom without boundaries, continues to blast its way across the democratic landscape, leading to severe cultural disorientation and anger among many people who often find it impossible to identify the source of that anger. And sixth, there is the refugee crisis that has been caused by the instability of the Middle East and the failures of democratic renewal in Latin America, which have led to a profound culture shock in both Western Europe and the United States. Now, those seem to me some of the principal grievances motivating those people who are often labeled populists today. There are other grievances in the populist agenda, and some of those other grievances, we should admit, reflect ignoble attitudes and corrosive ideas that are incompatible with the dignity of the human person and thus with the democratic project. Yet it would be a serious mistake, I think, to regard the 6 grievances I listed here as ignoble or irrational. They aren't. And to regard them as ignoble or irrational is, in an important sense, undemocratic. For in the sphere of culture, those grievances are often expressions of a people's most deeply held and felt religious and moral convictions. And if in the name of a false notion of liberation, those deeply held and felt religious and moral convictions are ruled out of public life, democracy is in serious trouble. So, what happens when these grievances, these fevers, if you will, interact with the forces in Western political life that have been accustomed to defining the boundaries of the argument over public policy? One of the things that happens is what I would call tribal epistemology or tribal thinking, which exists at many points along the political spectrum and especially at its hardened edges. By tribal epistemology or tribal thinking, I mean a kind of cognitive clannishness that makes it impossible to imagine that someone with a different public policy idea might just be honest, well-intentioned, maybe even right. This phenomenon is not only found on the far right, or among Trump voters, or Brexiteers, or supporters of Poland's Law and Justice Party, Hungary's Fidesz, or followers of Marine Le Pen in France. In fact, I think a very good argument could be made that this kind of clannish thinking and this refusal to concede that someone with a different idea might just be right began in its current form on the left, under the influence of Herbert Marcuse. But that's a story for another day. Whatever its contemporary genealogy, this kind of cognitive tribalism and the incapacity to see anything of value in what the other thinks or believes is now pandemic across the political landscape of the West. And that tribalism makes the robust encounter of competing ideas, which is essential to the democratic project, very difficult. Another thing we see today is a public space, a public atmosphere dominated by the loudest, most hysterical voices. The Facebook and Twitter demagogues who practice the political neo-Darwinism that I call the survival of the shrillest. This phenomenon is not limited to the crazier parts of the blogosphere. At all points along the political spectrum, left to right, and even among people who rightly think of themselves as serious thinkers, the tendency today is to let fly with rhetorical nuclear weapons at the first sign of disagreement. At the first sign of disagreement. And this kind of fevered public exchange leads in turn to debased public standards of debate. Or as my Ethics and Public Policy Center colleague Jim Bowman put it recently, decency itself has become partisan, and so is no longer decency in any traditional sense of the word. The result, Mr. Bowman noted, is that it's now, quote, taken for granted that politics is war and the enemy is other. Someone not subject to reason argument, but only an object for hatred and contempt. In what I have come to call this echo chamber of epithets, which a lot of rough language just constantly bounces around. The reductio ad Hitlerum tends to be the default position of those most concerned about populism. Here comes Hitler again. And the reductio ad diabolum, here comes Satan again, is the counter move among the aggrieved populace. Two more signals that the democratic project is in distress. For there really cannot be democracy without the exercise of reason, and there can be no democracy without a minimum of civility in which everyone declines to be considered infallible, and everyone is willing to acknowledge that the other just might have a point. In this kind of deeply disturbed situation, democratic renewal, whether it's in a new democracy like Ukraine, a slightly older set of democracies of the sort we find in Central Europe, or mature, supposedly mature democracies like Germany, France, Britain, the United States, Canada. Democratic renewal across this world in this season of discontent requires reclaiming, making our own again some basic truths about the democratic project. And I want to identify 5 of those truths that seem to me to have to be worked into the texture of democratic public life, like yeast into a loaf of dough. The first of these truths is that with the exception of human folly and stupidity, and what we would call in this university sin, nothing in history is permanent, including democracy. Democracy is not ordained by some Hegelian history with a capital H as its final and inevitable end. Democracy is by its nature an experiment in a people's capacity for self-government. And democracies can fail, as the example of the Weimar Republic in Germany between the end of the First World War and 1933 should remind us. Those of you who know some of that history know that Weimar Germany had a beautifully constructed democratic system designed after World War I by some very able people, including the great social scientist Max Weber. Yet the beautifully designed system proved incapable of absorbing the shocks of the Great Depression and the collapse of the world economy because the cultural foundations of the system were insecure. And the result of that was that Weimar Germany democratically produced a totalitarian system with lethal results. This is always, I think, a shadow over John Paul II's understanding of democracy and how fragile democracies could be, because he knew in his bones what the democratic failure of Weimar, which democratically produced the Hitler regime, could do. By the same token, it ought to be remembered, however, that democracies are quite capable of self-renewal. The democratic revolution of 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe displaced a great tyranny by the power of moral conviction wedded to national tradition, courage, and shrewd politics. The Maidan Revolution of Dignity is another example of the capacity of democratic self-renewal. Still, it is imperative that democratic renewal in this 21st century begin with a recognition that democracy has nothing inevitable about it. Democracy must not only be affirmed, bless you, democracy must be earned by every generation. The second truth to be reclaimed in renewing the democratic project is the truth that democracy is not a machine that can run by itself. Or for the techie people among you, democracy is not a hardware that can be run by any software. What we mean by the democratic project today is in fact a complex system of three interlocking parts. One part of the system is a democratic political community in which the people govern themselves through representatives regularly elected. The judiciary is independent of the legislature and the executive, and civil liberties, which define the non-state space known as civil society, are codified in law. Another part of the system is a market-based economy, which is regulated by law and custom, but in which the state is not the chief economic actor. And the third part of the system, the one that is most often ignored, although it's the key to the proper functioning of everything else, is a vibrant public moral culture. It takes a certain kind of people living certain virtues to make free politics and free economics work so that the net result is genuine human flourishing. The machinery of democracy and the market cannot produce that flourishing on their own or by themselves. That's the hard lesson of Weimar, and it needs to be pondered by both political scientists and economists today. In the three interlocking systems of the contemporary democratic project, the moral cultural system's vitality is nurtured primarily by civil society. And among the free institutions of civil society, the family is of immense importance, because stable families are the first schools of freedom, and of freedom rightly understood as freedom for excellence, freedom for nobility, freedom for solidarity. The family is where we first learn that the world is not just about me. First learn that in the family. The family is where the tyrant, the dictator that each one of us was when we were 2 years old, begins to be transformed into the mature citizen who can help shape the public life of a democracy. Democratic renewal will therefore look carefully to the revitalization of both civil society and the family. The third truth, it seems to me, required for democratic renewal is that democratic politics and free economics cannot be sustained over the long haul by a liberal culture. If by liberal culture we mean a culture built on the notions that there are no deep truths written into the human person, that there is at best your truth and my truth, and that the good is what an individual wills or wants. Or as the great moral philosopher Frank Sinatra used to put it, I did it my way. Such a truth-starved and morally thin culture is incapable of sustaining free politics and free economics. Why? Because it can't answer the question, why be civil? Why be tolerant? Why accept the electoral choice of the majority? Nor can the culture of me sustain free economies, because the culture of me cannot explain why productive efficiency and shareholder satisfaction are not the only measures of a free economy that is free in a truly human sense. And at the bottom of the bottom line, this culture of me is incapable of defending the claim that the democratic project, for all of its flaws and discontents, is nonetheless morally superior to the various authoritarianisms on offer in Moscow and Beijing and Caracas and Havana, because it is itself committed to the authoritarianism of me. the authoritarianism of what some of us call the imperial autonomous self. That same historian I quoted earlier, George Nash, reminds us that successful democracies require both statesmanship and civic virtue. And there will be very little statesmanship of the sort needed in many Western democracies today without a new flourishing of the virtues. For statesmen are made, not born, and statesmanship is not a matter of genetic inheritance, but of learning from a culture of virtue and its truths, and living the experience of a culture of virtue with all of its disciplines. So democratic renewal in the 21st century will require a serious rebuilding of the culture of what used to be called Republican virtue, in which the claims of individual rights are once again linked to responsibilities. I have a right of free speech because I have the responsibility to participate in public life. A culture of Republican virtue in which the claims of individual rights are once again linked to responsibilities, and the promotion of the common good is once again understood to be everyone's civic responsibility. The fourth truth we need to reclaim involves the free economy. It's striking that both the Bolsheviks and Friedrich Hayek recognize that markets are essential to the democratic project, which is, of course, why the Bolsheviks sought to destroy markets and why Hayek defended economic freedom. Hayek understood that the decision to fix prices or plan production doesn't lead to an unaccountable army of paid snoops and arbitrary bureaucrats. It necessarily implies them, because those are the only possible means of enforcing it. And of course, things got worse than that in the Soviet case, as my friend Ann Applebaum has shown. The Gulag system of slave labor camps for political prisoners was not an accidental component of the Leninist-Stalinist system. It was an essential component of that 20th century alternative to the democratic project. So the question for democratic renewal is not then yes or no to markets or capitalism. The question is how temper and direct markets so that the enormous energies let loose by economic freedom contribute to rebuilding the foundations of civic life rather than eroding those foundations through that particular form of self-absorption called consumerism, in which human worth is measured by what a person has rather than who a person is. This is obviously a task for both the political and moral cultural systems, the political system through law and regulation, the moral cultural system through the formation of character. There should be ample room within the project of democratic renewal for debating how large a role law and regulation should play in the free economy. But those committed to democratic renewal must recognize and address the fact that corrupt business practices and corrupt politics feed off of each other and make both the consolidation of democracy and the renewal of democracy impossible. Democracy and the market could self-destruct, as I suggested earlier, because nothing is permanent in history. But at this moment, for those of us who cherish the dignity of the human person, who cherish the possibility of participation in public life, who value the rule of law, who enjoy the adventure of entrepreneurial inventiveness, those of us who honor the noble task of deliberating in common, the best means of achieving goods imperfectly known and never fully achieved. For people like that, the democratic project, understood as this three-part system of a democratic political community, a market-centered economy, and a vibrant public moral sector is the only serious option. Illiberal democracy is not an option for those who cherish these goods. Xi Jinping authoritarianism or Putinite kleptocracy are not serious options, and nobody is seriously imagining a return to benign monarchy. So the task ahead is one of healing and reforming the democratic project in its three component parts. Those who wish to take up that task and who recognize that multiculturalism and transnationalism cannot inspire the loyalties that make democratic solidarity possible must foster the development of an alternative to ethno-nationalism and xenophobia, which are two other threats to the democratic project. I call that alternative civic patriotism, enlightened and enlivened by Republican virtue. In European contexts, that civic patriotism will involve an embrace of what has been understood for centuries to be home, linguistically and culturally, but which now sometimes seems threatened by a bland yet smothering multiculturalism and an aggressive transnationalism that seems deaf and blind to legitimate concerns about national cultural integrity. That embrace of home can and must be open rather than narrow and closed, and it ought not be confused with strident forms of ethno-nationalism that deny to those who are religiously or racially other any possibility of finding home where the majority religious or ethnic or racial group has long found it. On the other hand, partisans of the European Union must recognize that national identities forged by centuries of experience have real value, and that the nation-state remains, for the overwhelming majority of people in the West, the basic unit of political identity. In America, the development of civic patriotism will reflect a renewed commitment to those truths which, in the Declaration of Independence, the American founders staked: their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. Which means that Americans must once again affirm, and I suggest this would not be a bad idea for others too, must once again affirm that there are self-evident truths that can be known by reason. There are truths built into us, that knowing these truths teaches us both our personal obligations and the limits of the legitimate role of the state in our lives, and in the American context, that affirming those truths is what makes someone an American, irrespective of where their grandparents came from. Radical skepticism about the human capacity to know anything with certainty, and the moral relativism that is skepticism's inevitable byproduct, are incompatible with a renewal of Republican virtue and with the development of a vibrant civic patriotism. Nor can skepticism and relativism of the kind that we find all over the intellectual life of the West today provide effective cultural barriers against the 21st century drift by democracies old and democracies new into one or another form of authoritarianism. The authoritarianism of illiberal democracy and the authoritarianism characterized by the heavy use of state power to impose the culture of me on all of society. The most urgent challenge at this moment of democratic discontent, then, is the challenge to rebuild a democratic culture marked by respect for basic human rights, a clear understanding that those human rights are not mere expressions of personal willfulness, a commitment to live freedom in service to the common good, and a renewal of that solidarity that the French philosopher Jacques Maritain called civic virtue, civic friendship, the friendship of citizens united by a common purpose, something, I suggest, that was experienced in a profound way in Ukraine on the Maidan almost 5 years ago. The challenge of this moment, and I think this especially speaks to the young people here, also requires a rebirth of the idea that politics is a vocation, not simply a career or an exercise of self-expression or a method of brand enhancement. The vocation of politics, Max Weber wrote in 1919, requires both an ethic of moral conviction and an ethic of responsibility. Put another way, statesmanship requires a firm commitment to certain built-in truths about human beings and their communities, and the skills taught by the virtue of prudence in making those truths live and flourish in our common life. This university, which is so distinctive not only in this part of the world, but throughout the world, is in a unique position to help foster this project of democratic renewal. And I hope that these few brief analytic thoughts about what are the roots of the present discontents and what might be some fruitful roads of exploration will help you fulfill not only the great opportunity that is yours, but if you will permit me to say it, the great responsibility that is yours. Thank you very much. Democracy and Its Discontents, which you can find at the website of the journal National Affairs, which is www.nationalaffairs.com.
Okay, dear friends, dear colleagues, we open a series of questions, and who want to ask question, please raise your hand. Those processes which we face is now in the European Union, Brexit, processes in Poland, in Hungary, and in other countries, says that something wrong went with the European Union. In your opinion, which way will take these processes in the European Union, and what can you tell about this recent visit of President of France, Emmanuel Macron, to the session of the Conference of Bishops in France, where he told that this damaged relation between state and church should be repaired?
Those are, the first question is huge, very, very, very large. I think there has been some forgetting in some circles critical of the European Union that it actually began as a project of Christian democracy. The three principal founders of the EU, de Gasperi from Italy, Adenauer from Germany, and Schuman from France, were all serious Catholics who understood that the rivalry between the children of Charlemagne, the West Franks known as the French, and the East Franks known as the Germans, had just about destroyed Europe twice in the 20th century, and that something had to be done to bind the West Franks and the East Franks together. So they began functionally with the coal and steel community. If we're not fighting each other over coal and steel, that's a step ahead. Then comes the common market. Then comes the expansion of the common market. Then comes Maastricht. Then comes the euro. Then comes the further expansion of the EU in 2004, 2005. Now, late modernity being late modernity, all of this was accompanied by a fantastic development of bureaucracies and a transfer of sovereignty to those bureaucracies and sometimes to transnational courts that particularly people with a very strong sense of national sovereignty of the sort you find in Britain were finding increasingly uncomfortable. I would have hoped that Brexit would have been a signal to the present leadership of the European Union that the project needs some rethinking, that you cannot abolish national identity and feelings of national sovereignty by transnational fiat, and that there was a lot of work to do both at the EU level and in the member states of the EU to build up the foundations of democratic culture within those countries. This is not particularly good news, I understand, for Ukraine, for whom Europe means something different. It means full incorporation into the West, which should happen. I mean, this is a part of the Western world, and there should be ways to recognize that, both politically and economically, and I think in security terms. I mean, I have long favored the incorporation of Ukraine into NATO, and I'm sorry that didn't happen rather a long time ago. But I think you must recognize that the EU project is in trouble. And the EU must recognize that the EU project is in trouble. And I think it's easier, your recognition is going to come more easily than a recognition in Brussels. Now, in a longer view of this history, I would hope that these present discontents with the European project among some of its founding members would compel a reflection upon what ended 100 years ago, the First World War, a moral cultural catastrophe that began in 1914 and that in some sense did not end until 1991, because everything that happened after the First World War happened in some sense because of the First World War. Now, what's the answer to that? The answer to that is what John Paul II called the new evangelization. There is no way that Europe is going to recover its moral cultural vitality after 77 years in which there were 3 world wars, 1, 2, and the Cold War, without a rebirth of Christianity in Europe. Now, that gets us to your second point. What do we make of Monsieur Macron, going to see the French bishops? He's a clever politician. He's trying to put together some sort of a new coalition that will allow him, first of all, to govern the country and deal with some pretty severe economic problems, which are going to require some people to get used to a different way of living than they have become accustomed to. And perhaps he sees the bishops as helpful in that. I don't know what precisely he means by let's re-examine this laïcité. Maybe Bishop Boris has some ideas on this. No one should want a return to the ancien regime, in which church and state are welded together. That is not a good idea. And if you doubt that, just look north at what has happened to Russian Orthodoxy, in no small part because it is the chaplain to the state. So you don't want that. What do you want? I think minimally what you want is a public space in which people can bring religiously informed moral arguments without being told that's not fair or that's out of bounds. Now, the people who are bringing those religiously informed moral arguments have to have the wit, the creativity to deploy those arguments in a way that people who don't share their theological convictions can understand. If that's what he's proposing, I think that's fine. But I'm not sure what he's proposing, and I rather doubt he is either. What the French bishops are thinking, I don't know. I hope what they're thinking is that in the social doctrine of John Paul II, there is a model. This is also true of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. There's a model of how to be a public church without being a partisan church. A public church without being a state church, or a public church without being a church closely identified with one political party, and that's what they ought to be working on. But the basic agenda for the French bishops and for the Belgian bishops and the Dutch bishops and the German bishops and the Swiss bishops and the Spanish bishops and the Portuguese bishops and the Italian bishops ought to be, how do we reconvert this country? How do we reconvert this country?
Reflecting upon my childhood, my teachers, my parents, reflecting upon ideals that attracted, I think, leaders of the various revolutions here, whether it's people like our Miroslav Marinovich in the 70s, whether it's the youth, Yudi's generation in the late 80s and 90s when they were students. I have a sense that people want the fruits of democracy, but they've lost the sense that it requires a certain human maturity, a moral profundity, and very hard work. The teachers that are here, people, let's say, about 45 and over, and the students have completely different historical experiences. Did I ask you students already who Volodymyr Shcherbetsky was? I asked you, right? You now know. Yeah, last time you didn't. And the only point I want to make is how different generations can become with within a very short time in the same place. The prosperity, the consumer goods that are the fruits of democracy in Ukraine have become expected, and those expectations lead to easy delusions and easy disappointments which in turn lead to a disillusionment in the effort. I don't know if young people in view can imagine that just 30 years ago there were 85% less automobiles on the streets. So there are, I think, 20 times as many. Yaroslav Hrycak is often, and I remember already in the 90s, he would note that, you know, this idea that it was better in the Soviet Union was so absurd. The problem was that people's expectations just kept growing. I mean, Olena would describe to me how she would get up at 4 a.m., and this is yesterday, it seems, in my life, in 1990, to get in line to get milk. The younger generation just cannot imagine this. And the desire for instant gratification is immense. We see the fruits of other people's hard labors, and we want the fruits. But the question is, are we ready for those labors? And I think the big question regarding this university and its role outside in society and inside here is whether there will be outside there and inside here an understanding of the process and of the foundation of the fruits that people admire. Among the elite of Ukraine, the thinking elite of Ukraine, today, it started yesterday, it might last till tomorrow, who knows how long. This university is one of the most admired phenomenon in the country. But knowing those admirers, whether they're artists, intellectuals, politicians, people in business, I've come to sense that many of them do not fully understand the human maturity, the moral profundity, and the hard work that is necessary for the birth of, let's say, the Sheptytsky Center, or the quality of relations in this building, or the nature of the friendship that we share. Why are we friends? A bishop in Paris and a theologian intellectual in Washington. And that understanding, there's just no shortcut. There's no easy way. My phrase is, you know, it's not Nescafe, where you can have boiling water, powder, and gratification. Like that. Now. Right away. Without sacrifice. I think the Maidan reminded us of the cost of things profound. We are in a dramatic way blessed by the fact that a member of our community gave his life on the Maidan. I don't know if today's students who are in the first and second and third year can imagine that somebody that was teaching them is killed in cold blood on a beautiful sunny day like today in the central square of our city, of our country. But sometimes even such a sacrifice is what democracy needs. Because the opposition to democracy is evil. The opposition to people's dignity is evil. And that evil can sometimes be strong, and it is usually cynical. And that's why I think reflection, like you inspired today, George, is so important for us. I am encouraged by the fact that over the last quarter century, after conversations, and Father Peter was in on the conversation from day -1, people, Yaroslav and Elena, we sat in their apartment. One of the top public intellectuals of the country, and the author, Olena, his wife, wrote the first post-Soviet text on Western civilization. They lived in an apartment, one-room apartment with their 2 children, where the toilet was in the middle of a kitchen. And when we would come over for some wine and conversation at night, if somebody had to go to the bathroom, everybody had to leave the kitchen. The box, the wooden box covering the toilet had to be picked up. And then it was covered again. I'm sorry if I'm being so graphic, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter. Well, it but it didn't stop you. It didn't stop you from thinking big. Your desire for a bathroom, a normal separate bathroom, was not greater than your desire for a textbook on Western civilization. In other words, your desire for an education of a new generation. And the question is, will you students have such a heart? And will you desire for others? That was the big word that George mentioned. Will your desire for the other be big enough to make a sacrifice? The beauty of good democracy is when you make that sacrifice, you help the other, but you grow yourself. And fortunately, the Hrytsaks have a different kind of bathroom, but they've helped hundreds of people directly and inspired literally millions by that process. I don't know. I hope that willingness for depth, for hard work, for maturity, that it's there. But we'll see.
Yeah, and let me just add a footnote to that. That is every bit as true of a 230-year-old democracy like the United States as it is of a new democracy like Ukraine. These are challenges for everyone. And I think that the most corrosive force in the Western world today is what I call the culture of be, the culture of me, the Frank Sinatra, I did it my way concept of freedom. And one of the things, Voltaire would be spinning in his grave at the idea that the Catholic Church has a nobler idea of freedom than the French Fifth Republic. But that's the truth. Catholic Church believes in freedom for excellence, freedom for nobility, freedom for solidarity, freedom tethered to truth and ordered to goodness. And that's what we all, in our different vocations and in our different social environments, that's what we have to help the Western world reclaim, is a nobler idea of freedom.
Thank you very much. Again and again, I was your student at Terzo Millennio
Yes, you were.
Institute.
Do you still have your certificate?
Yeah. My question is about, in your lecture, you have touched some aspects of the culture wars in Western Europe and North America. Not so long ago, maybe a few weeks ago, I have read in the New York Times that Jordan Peterson now is the most influential intellectual in the world. What do you think about the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson?
I wish I were his literary agent. Somebody's making a lot of money in this. I think it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I don't find him terribly deep or profound, but the fact that in his university, which is part of my alma mater in Toronto, and where Father Peter has to live and breathe and have his being these days, the fact that this man was willing to stand up and say, no, I am enough political correctness is enough, has turned him into a huge figure. Now, he's in many ways a figure of the internet, which means that his fame may have the half-life of a fruit fly. I mean, it comes and goes, but his willingness to challenge the tyranny of political correctness in the name of genuine intellectual life, I think was very important. But he is still taking a hammering on his own campus, as Father Peter will tell you. We may be reaching a point of maximum absorption of nonsense. I mean, at the point at which people say, all right, fine, enough is enough. The question is how to turn that enough is enough in a positive direction, and not to use it to reopen old historical wounds, to propose these ethno-nationalist notions that I was discussing a moment ago, to turn it in a positive direction. This is, again, a very important role for the church. Every time the church says no to something, it's because of a yes. We need to figure out how to communicate that better. That when we say no to certain things, it's because we're saying yes to other things. And because we think the no actually makes for happier human lives. The Magna Carta of the Catholic moral life is the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. That's where the moral life begins. The moral life is about beatitude. Beatitude is a fancy word for happiness, or in the current political science jargon, human flourishing. That's where we begin. And if we can communicate that to people, we may have a better chance of seizing this moment of enough is enough and pointing it in a positive direction.
Hello, I'm a student at the EPE program here, and so it comes as no surprise that that secularism is the huge part of democracy nowadays. That, however, leads to the reduction of the moral principles in the democracy. So basically, moral principles give way to the democracy principles. So my question is that going to be preserved in the democracy nowadays, or is it going to be changed soon, or is it going to to change someday soon.
Yeah. I think we have to distinguish here between two streams of democratic thought and experience. There is this French laicist, continental Enlightenment, religion and democracy don't mix. Religion might be a nice private hobby for people, but it has nothing to do with public life. And then there is the English, Scottish, American version of this, in which religious conviction was very much part of the democratic project from the beginning. I think what we have discovered, or are beginning to discover, I hope people are beginning to discover, rediscover, is that this thing we call Western civilization is like a stool with 3 legs. And the legs are marked Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. Biblical religion, which taught the West that life is not cyclical or random, life is adventure, life is pilgrimage, life is journey. Life is what is embodied in your beautiful new chapel by those pilgrimage ramps in there. Athens. Human reason can get at the truth of things. Rome. The rule of law is superior to the rule of brute force. Now, in the 19th century, a lot of European high culture kicked the Jerusalem leg out from under the stool. The God of the Bible is the enemy of human freedom and human maturation. Okay? Turns out, though, that when the Jerusalem leg collapses or is kicked out, the Athenian leg begins to wobble. Because if you do not have it in your mind that the Creator imprinted reason, his reason, into the world. The world was created through the logos, through reason. If you lose that biblical conception, suddenly reason can't defend itself anymore. And you get into the, ultimately into where postmodernity found itself. There's only your truth and my truth, but there's nothing called the truth. This is a prescription for authoritarianism, because if there's only Bishop Boris's truth and there's only George's truth, but there's nothing that Bishop Boris and George agree is the truth, then when his truth collides with my truth, we have no standard by which to settle the argument, so he beats me up or I beat him up. He imposes his power on me, or I impose my power on him. So the collapse of the Athenian leg then leads to the collapse of the Roman leg in the rule of law. Because the rule of law is not about him beating me up or my beating him up. So, that's a complicated way of saying that the West has to rebuild all 3 legs. The laïcité project has failed. It leads only to different forms of authoritarianism, one of which is what Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger called in April 2005 the dictatorship of relativism. The state uses its power to impose moral relativism on everybody else. So that's what I think of that. And I think we have to, not in a, we can't say this and say, look, we told you so, you dummies. This was never going to work. The laïcité project was doomed from the start. Let's be a bit more mature than that. These are people who are deeply confused right now. The secular, if we think things haven't worked out the way we imagined 25 years ago, so does the secular world. And we at least have an anchor in all of this in what is celebrated in the chapel. So we need to be firm, but also welcoming and saying, you know, isn't it about time we had a new discussion about this? You know, Robespierre has been dead for a long time. Voltaire has been dead for a long time. Auguste Comte has been dead for a long time. You know, let's reconvene a serious conversation about faith and reason, because the two need each other.
First of all, thank you for your enlightening lecture. I have a minor point where I beg to disagree. You diagnose the problem as a crisis of democracy. I would say democracy is really flourishing. See what Brexit is. It's perfectly democratic process. Putin was elected and Orban by the democratic procedures. I believe probably we're not talking about crisis of democracy, we're talking about a specific kind of crisis of democracy, which is liberal democracy. If you accept this, so does it make any changes in your conclusions? Because it's basically facing the crisis of liberalism rather than crisis of democracy.
I would say it's a crisis of liberalism in the sense that liberalism has reduced the democratic project to a series of functions without recognizing the need for this moral cultural foundation. Putin, I mean, first of all, let's stop pretending that those are elections in any reasonable sense of the term. Orban is a different story. And the Kaczynski phenomenon in Poland is a different story. There we are seeing, I think, inadequate moral cultural depth, which combined with historic resentments and passions has empowered a kind of demagoguery that now is apparently quite appealing to people. Now, as an American citizen, I am in a weak position to talk about demagoguery. So is Father Galaja in Canada. Let me get the knife in there. But this is a problem all over the Western world. And I think it is a problem of moral cultural foundations. It's the Weimar problem. Hitler was elected. Now, Hitler immediately got the parliament through the Enabling Act to turn him into a dictator for what was supposed to be a period, and everybody with any sense should have known where that was going. Putin is empowered in part by a deeply wounded political culture. And he is selling a product that appeals to historical resentment, to what I believe is a false national narrative, for which you are paying the price here, and which the West, because it doesn't understand this problem of moral cultural foundations, is very ill-equipped to deal with it. So when I say democracy, I don't simply mean people putting ballots into a box. I mean this complex system of three interacting sectors, polity, economy, culture, of which the culture is the key. The culture is the key. I watched in my own country during my own lifetime a revolution in racial attitudes that made possible a legal revolution. The culture changed, the law changed, the law helped the culture change farther, but the fundamental change was in people's hearts. This is unfair. This is not right. And that civil rights revolution in the United States was led by Christian leaders, of whom the most notable, of course, was Dr. Martin Luther King, who died 50 years ago, a couple of weeks ago. So in addition to '89 and the Maidan Revolution, there's that as an example of democratic renewal. Now, final note on those good points that you raise. I don't think the church in either Poland or Hungary is addressing the present situation very well. The Hungarian church I don't know well at all, and I'm going to Budapest later this year to try to learn some more. The Polish church I know very well. And I think the bishops of Poland are making a colossal mistake by so closely identifying the Catholic project in Poland with Mr. Kaczynski's project. I would have said the same thing if they were attaching the Catholic project to Mr. Komorowski's project. This kind of identification of Catholicism with a particular political party is always very bad for the gospel and for what, and maybe this is a good note to close on, for what is the reality in all of our countries. And that is that the way the faith was transmitted to many of us, in your case under extraordinarily difficult situation, and circumstances, in mine under a much easier situation. It was transmitted by family and cultural and ethnic inheritance. That does not work anywhere in the world today. It doesn't work in Latin America, which is becoming increasingly Pentecostalist. It doesn't work in Ireland, which is about to rival Quebec for being the most religiously arid place in the Western world. Doesn't work in Spain, doesn't work in Portugal, doesn't work in America. The faith has to be proposed. And part of that proposing, given the intellectual confusions we were talking about, part of that proposing has to be the quality of our lives. We have to model a nobler way of living so that people encountering that say, well, that's good. How can you live that way? And then the door is open to the evangelical offer. I can live that way because I am a friend of the Lord Jesus Christ. Can I tell you about him and invite you into the community of his friends? It's an awfully long answer to a question, but I think we have got to go. But thank you all very, very much for having me back. We are always happy to have students from UKU at my summer program in Krakow, and I think everybody, you guys know how to get people into that. We've been very blessed by our UKU students in the past, and I hope to see some of you in Krakow in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a very nice journey, beginning with your inaugural videotape lecture till today's live lecture. Thank you very much for inspirational talk, and I hope we will meet once again, and not only once again.